Since the time of Alexander the Great, results on the battlefield had much to do with the great generals who led their armies to victory or followed them into exile. A great military mind was able to see an opportunity where others saw only a lost cause. A great general was able to develop a plan of attack that could outwit an opponent or respond to an offensive action with speed and agility. In the 20th century came the greatest war the world had ever known. A war between many nations that pitted modern armor, aircraft, and weaponry on a scale unimaginable by the armies of old. World War II. In this war, many were called to greatness. Leaders emerged from small country towns and large urban areas. No nation was more blessed with military leaders than the United States of America. Generals who rose from the ranks to lead their troops to battle. Men who were born to greatness, and men who had greatness thrust upon them. This is their story. The famous generals of World War II. They were legends in their own time and remain so today. Their lives were an inspiration, and their deeds the stuff of history. Here now is the story of General Joseph W. Stillwell. Joseph W. Stillwell had already spent many years in the service of his country when he was called upon to go through an ordeal that was both physically and mentally exhausting. But he carried on, where younger and seemingly stronger men fell by the wayside. Although his bluntness of speech earned him the nickname of Vinegar Joe, to the millions of men who served under him, he was the kindest and most modest man who ever lived. To all of them, he was, and in memory still remains, Uncle Joe. Joseph Stillwell was born in March of 1883 in Palatka, Florida. His childhood and early youth, however, were to be spent in Yonkers, New York. Even in earliest years, in appearance and in character, he was typically American. And so the decision to send Joe Stillwell to the military academy at West Point. The year was 1900, and the decision was a fortunate one. Few men could know that young men with qualities of courage and leadership would be needed to serve the United States through ensuing years of crisis. Between the lines of the yellowed class yearbook, one can read hints of those qualities. For the young quarterback, they were already winning a permanent niche among West Point's football immortals. They were destined to serve him on fields broader than the gridiron. Graduation from the academy did not end Joseph Stillwell's association with West Point. The newly commissioned second lieutenant of infantry was to spend 11 of the next 14 years teaching a succession of classes. His field instruction, foreign languages. A natural aptitude in these subjects was to prove as fortunate for the U.S. as was the decision to make the military his profession. In the crowded years not spent at the academy, there would be an assignment to serve at schools and at tours of duty in the Philippines and at home. Meanwhile, history was setting the stage for the first of our century's major crises, World War I. In its flames, untried American leadership would be tested and tempered. Joseph Stillwell would be among those who received their baptism of fire. Over there was the patriotic song of the hour. Over there sailed young American manhood to fight in the first international conflict of our history. With the temporary rank of Major, Joseph Stillwell disembarked in France during the bleak, disheartening December of 1917. There followed a brief period of service with the British Division. Then, with his fluency in French, he became liaison officer with the French 17th Corps. For the young major, there was action at Verdun, Le Fère, Toul, Saint-Mihiel. For his service in this last engagement, Stillwell, now Assistant Chief of Staff, 4th Army Corps, received the Distinguished Service Medal. "For military attainments of a high order," read the citation. With the war's end, it was now Colonel Stillwell who went on to serve with the Army of Occupation within Germany. There he remained until July of 1919. By now, the enthusiastic scenes welcoming American troops back to civilian life were past history. For a returned professional soldier, there would be no termination of service. In full recognition of his talent for language, Joseph Stillwell's next assignment of duty was to take him to Beijing, there to study and attain fluency in the many Chinese dialects. With him went his wife and their 3 children. 2 more would be born during the years in China. The comfortable Stillwell home came to reflect his growing appreciation of Oriental art. It was to earn him recognition as a connoisseur. To the Chinese people around him, the perceptive Stillwell brought his own humane understanding. Out of it came mutual respect and warm regard. One day in the future, these would help forge military victory. But before that day, there were to be years of service for Joseph Stillwell. Now, he must return to the United States. Beside him at Fort Benning's Infantry Training School, fellow future general officers taught and studied. George C. Marshall, Omar Bradley, men who were to become great generals in a future war. At Fort Leavenworth's Command and General Staff School, there were additional years of study. Then, once again, it was back to China, this time as military attaché to the United States Embassy in Beijing. Here he remained as the clash of conflicting interests between Japan and the awakening giant China led inevitably to incident, and incident to all-out war. The incident was Manchuria. The military machine of the Japanese required no organizing. For the military clique which then held power had long anticipated this day. The overall plan was to decimate China, reduce her province by province. Japan's modern air force would meanwhile be destroying China's sources of power to resist. The Chinese proved no defense against the perfected military efficiency of the Japanese. On hand, as American observer, was Colonel Joseph Stillwell. It became his growing and unshakable conviction that the Chinese soldier was a first-class fighting man, needing only first-class equipment, first-class leadership. Chiang Kai-shek, at that time thought to be the one leader able to preserve Chinese unity, was by now forced to withdraw to the interior city of Chongqing. From here, he sought endlessly to enlist the aid of other nations. There had already occurred the Panay incident, in which an American ship in Chinese waters had been sunk by Japanese bombers. This had crystallized the American sentiment that had long inclined to sympathy for China. Aid had come as young Americans volunteered their services. Acting unofficially as private citizens, one such group, the Flying Tigers, were winning fame as they took an impressive toll of Japanese planes. As China's armies engaged in their unequaled struggle, arms and equipment were now made available. To cut off these sources of material aid, Japan systematically occupied or blockaded one after another of China's port cities. In effect, Japan built a wall around China. Deprived of needed supply from without, a weakened China would be vulnerable to the heavy blows of the invading forces. The former American observer Stillwell was now back home again, serving at California's Presidio. A major general, he commanded the Third Army Corps. Step by step, history was setting the stage for its climactic tragedy. Out of that tragedy, Joseph Stillwell would emerge to play a heroic role. From a country stunned by disaster, General Stillwell was sent to China, there to serve as chief of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek's Allied staff, and with a small American staff to take nominal command of China's 5th and 6th Armies. The new responsibility brought him his 3rd star. In the absence of clear-cut Allied command lines, General Stillwell's first job was to help in the defense of Burma. Burma offered the only route by which material aid could be fed into China. China must be built up, made stronger and stronger until her allies could join her in going over to the offensive. That would be a far-off day, for President Roosevelt gave priority to the European theater of war. To build up China, supplies were trucked in over the newly built Burma Road. The Burma Road was started by the Chinese after the Japanese invasion of China in 1937. According to one eyewitness, it was scratched out of the mountains with fingernails. For months, some 200,000 labored, and many died so that blockaded China could fight on. Late in 1939, the road was completed, following the ancient trade route used in the Middle Ages by caravans bearing silk and jade, amber and ivory. Now that route was to be traveled by caravans of guns and fuel, ammunition and food, across the land bridge of Burma to China. To keep that country alive in its struggle with Japan, just as Russia had been kept alive in its battle against Germany by the land bridge of Iran. The Nazis tried to destroy that lifeline, but it was saved by the British victory at El Alamein and by the Russians at Stalingrad. China was not as fortunate. 1 month after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese struck at the land bridge of Burma. A defeated China would mean India invaded, and increased pressure on General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz in the Pacific. The invasion started in January 1942. Both on the ground and in the air, the Japanese had overwhelming superiority. On the Allied side, General Alexander headed small forces of British, Indians, and Burmese, and General Stillwell commanded Chinese troops sent by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. The Japanese sought to cut off China's supply line from Rangoon to Mandalay and then to the Burma Road, running from Lashio to Kunming. They struck from Thailand toward the vital port of Rangoon. General Claire Chennault and his American volunteer group of Flying Tigers, together with small units of the RAF, helped to ward off the offensive. The Japanese attacked Rangoon in force. Rangoon fell. The enemy swept on to central Burma along the road to Mandalay, where, by air and ground, with the aid of fifth columnists and looters, they destroyed that city. The Burma which was to know Stillwell's exploits had become a battle scene. General Stillwell and his Chinese, together with outnumbered British, Free French, and Dutch troops, fought on. But the effort was doomed. The Japanese steamroller pushed on. It had administered humiliating defeats to the Allies in the Pacific and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. It had taken over thousands of square miles, together with peoples and resources. Now it rolled across Burma. India's borders lay open to attack. Worst of all, that last vital land route, the Burma Road, lay useless. Once again, the old lesson must be learned. Courage alone is not enough. For the Allies, withdrawal became retreat. Retreat, a nightmare route. The Burma Road was cut. Thousands of refugees choked the roads as Alexander and Stillwell were forced to retreat with what was left of their armies. The last to leave were the demolition squads that scorched the earth, destroyed equipment, put fire to oil supplies. As the Allies retreated, they were joined by an ever-growing mass of refugees, Burmese whose homes and lives had been shattered. The Allies did what they could for these refugees, and through brilliant leadership and individual fortitude, managed to keep ahead of the Japanese. They retreated along elephant trails, through jungle, across rivers and mountains, to the safety of India. In the ordeal, Joseph Stillwell's full stature revealed itself. Refusing the comforts his age and rank might have claimed, he personally conducted one group of 400 battered troops, Burmese nurses, and civilians to the safety of India. There, at New Delhi, he was to utter the now classic admission of defeat and announce his determination to go back and wipe it out. There was the honesty, the directness, the tough moral fiber that characterized the man.
I claim we got a hell of a beating. We got run out of Burma, and it's humiliating as hell. I think we ought to find out what caused it, go back and retake the place.
The battered campaign hat and shirt sleeves now became a familiar sight as the job of regrouping and training began. Burma covers approximately the same area as Texas. On its western border lies India. On its east, China, Indochina, and Thailand. To many, Burma is a land of legend, a shrine of Buddhism with its pagodas, its fabled road to Mandalay, its colorful cities and villages, its strange and picturesque people. To the Allies, however, who were to fight there, Burma is a land of perpetual struggle against nature, with jungles so thick that whole armies can pass within a short distance of one another without detection. Wide and turbulent rivers that are almost impassable. Mountain barriers reaching their greatest height in the Himalayas, highest range in the world. It's a land of extreme climate, intense cold, heat, and monsoons. Rain as great as anywhere on Earth. Its swamps are breeding grounds for malarial mosquitoes, cholera, beriberi, typhus, dysentery. Tropical fevers and sores plague its inhabitants. This was the land where Stillwell and the Allies had to fight. The task of reopening the land bridge of Burma was a tremendous one. General Stillwell's first act after the Japanese invasion was the formation of an American command known as CBI, China, Burma, India. From China came thousands of Chinese. They were carried over the Himalayas by planes of the American Air Force to Ramgarh in India. Here, under CBI, a huge training station had been started. On the British side, the Commander-in-Chief of India Command was Field Marshal Sir Archibald Wynne, later to become Viceroy and to be succeeded in his military leadership by General Sir Claude Auchinleck. On the shoulders of these men fell the responsibility of raising and training huge armies for the defense of India. It wasn't long before India became a vast armed camp. From the independent kingdom of Nepal came the Gurkhas. From the Naga Hills, Naga headhunters joined forces with the Allies. From East Africa and West Africa came more troops. From Burma came the Burma Rifles, and from the Chin Hills, Chin and Kachin tribesmen. Scots, Irish, English, Welsh, Australian, New Zealander, Indian, Gurkha, Burmese, African, Chinese, American. Never was there such a diverse army. In the meantime, in China, roads packed with refugees gave evidence of the terrific struggle against the Japanese advance. There were attempts to push through other trails. Mule packs were driven over the Himalayas to China at freezing altitudes. But the cargo they could carry was pitifully small, and the time it took incredibly long. The first step was the construction of an air bridge, across which supplies were to be flown by the pilots of the American Transport Command, shuttling back and forth over what they called the hump. It was a slow process. Equipment had to be taken apart so it could be loaded aboard planes. It was flown across Burma, over the Himalayas, to Kunming in China. Enemy interception, particularly from the important airbase at Mishinau, denied them a direct line and forced them north over a much higher route. They flew across jungles, through mist and fog, over mountains often at altitudes of over 20,000 feet. The menace of Japanese planes was ever present. They made a sky bridge 525 miles long over the roof of the world and carried across in unarmed transport planes the vital supplies needed by the American and Chinese air forces and the Chinese armies. But it wasn't enough. There was still desperate need for a land bridge. So at the end of 1942, the monument to Joseph Stillwell's ingenuity and drive was begun, the Lido Road. Starting at Lido in northern India, the plan was to drive through jungles, rivers, mountains, and Japanese opposition to a juncture with the Burma Road. A supply route was then forged from Calcutta to Lido by rail across the Lido-Burma Road to Kunming, and thence to Chongqing in China. Burma's mountains, rivers, railways, and highways extend from north to south. To push through this new road, the Allies would have to fight against the grain from west to east. The Lido Road was begun by a handful of men facing a task that had been called impossible. And so, with inadequate machinery and tools, a few American engineering units with a detachment of Chinese engineers and what Asiatic labor could be had started one of the greatest road-building jobs in history. Again and again, they saw their work collapse as the monsoon washed away whole stretches, but the road inched along. Modern machinery and trained manpower could clear up the Indian end of the projected loop. At the China end, it was a far different story. Here, it must be back-breaking manual labor with primitive tools. Men, women, and even children threw themselves into the Herculean task. China knew what was at stake, and China responded. At the docks in Calcutta, second largest city of the British Empire, supplies from America and Great Britain and the factories of India were piling up, waiting to be hauled to the Lido Road and the hump. Some of the supplies were sent by water in primitive flat boats and barges. Almost as cumbersome a route was the Bengal-Assam Railway. It took a circuitous road, making long detours to outlying tea plantations, switching 3 times to different gauge rails over a roadbed that had to be constantly repaired as a result of the monsoon. The fastest method was by cargo plane from Calcutta, but as yet there were too few planes available for this purpose. During this time, there was a secret expedition that came to light when a small group of worn and haggard men emerged from the Burmese jungle. They were called the Chindees. Their name was taken from the Burmese name for a legendary animal that symbolized protection. Almost as legendary was their leader, Brigadier, later Major General Charles Ward Wingate, professional soldier, pioneer jungle fighter. In the beginning of 1943, with complete secrecy, he had led British and Indian troops behind enemy lines into the heart of Burma, across the Chindwin River to the Irrawaddy, a distance of 200 miles, on foot. About this time, the first Quebec Conference took place between Roosevelt, Churchill, and the American and British chiefs of staff. Here, new plans were evolved for the war against Japan. A new command was formed, Southeast Asia Command, combining the British and American operations. The appointment of Supreme Allied Commander went to Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, former Chief of Combined Operations in Britain and leader of the Commandos. General Stillwell was appointed Deputy Supreme Allied Commander, in addition to his duties as Chief of Staff in China and head of CBI. Back in Southeast Asia, Mountbatten set up his Allied headquarters, choosing as its emblem the phoenix, the symbolic bird that emerged from the ashes of a destroying fire. Meanwhile, on the Lido Road, construction was progressing. Colonel, later to become Major General Lewis A. Pick, in command of the engineers. "The Lido Road is going to be built," said Pick. "Mud and rain and malaria be damned." The increase in material aid was making greater demands upon air transport. Suddenly, the hitherto ignored operation captured the imagination of the outside world. Flying over the hump became a familiar phrase. Behind the phrase lay the reality of every type of plane available, many lacking modern instruments, flying back and forth in unpredictable weather, their route over uncharted and treacherous mountains. The stockpile for this, seemingly the sideshow of the war effort, was mounting. The tools of battle were now ready and waiting to help settle an old score. The Asian theater had been remembered. Air power opened a prelude to attack. And to sustain it, fighters and bombers of the newest types arrived in increasing numbers. Soon, the prelude to attack was no longer a curtain raiser, but the first stage of fiery assault. The day had come. Men from China, from all parts of the British Commonwealth, from India and Burma, and from far-off Africa. Men of many races, many tongues were on the march, and with General Stillwell's diverse army, a growing number of American units. Among them were General Merrill's troops, experienced fighters from the Pacific Theater. Merrill's Marauders was to be their popular name, as they helped make history. As the bulldozers and tractors cleared away obstructions, Chinese infantry and artillery, trained by the American Army in Rangar, India, moved ahead to clear enemy opposition. Along this route, another great engineering project was starting, a fuel pipeline from India across Burma to China. Over 2,000 miles of pipe was laid like a huge artery across the savage terrain to carry a transfusion of gasoline, diesel oil, and lubricating oil. Each in its turn for the trucks and tanks, the machines, and the planes that were fighting in China. In 2 years of preparation, General Stillwell had molded a machine to beat the enemy at his own game, mountain and jungle warfare. Man-made weapons would exact casualties, but losses even heavier were inflicted by malaria, dysentery, hepatitis, and a wide range of tropical diseases. For the men who fought, Japanese metal could hit as hard, sickness could be as crippling as in any other theater. For them, Burma was no sideshow. Another problem was the treatment of casualties from enemy gunfire. Wounded men were sometimes carried miles by foot, by raft, mule, jeep, truck, ox cart. One of the great heroes of this campaign was Colonel Gordon Seagrave, formerly an American medical missionary who was with Stillwell on his retreat from Burma and went back to that country with a group of nurses of various native races and a series of mobile hospital units. Seagrave and his men and women performed operations under the most primitive conditions. The conquest of disease made huge strides. Now, the conquest of the Japanese had to keep pace. More and more Chinese were being trained at Rangar in India and at Kunming in China. These were to become part of the forces that were to strike at the enemy from the China-Burma border across the Salween River. In northern India, the Chinese-American Composite Wing had been organized by Major General Claire Chennault for the Generalissimo. A picked group of American volunteers was instructing Chinese pilots and crews to fly the latest type of planes. Cargo planes shuttled back and forth over the hump to China. Advanced troops in the Lido Road Drive were supplied in the air by the Troop Carrier Command. Supplies were carefully packed according to weight, size, and breakability. Then they were loaded on planes with parachutes attached. Now, to find the men hidden in the jungles who needed these supplies. In twisting mile-deep canyons and jungle-covered terrain, a miss by a few yards could be as bad as missing by a few hundred miles. The Allied Air Force of British and Americans in the newly formed Eastern Air Command bombed and strafed Japanese strongholds. In India and in China, huge air bases were being built for a new and powerful weapon, the B-29 Super Fortress. Thousands of Asiatic laborers, men, women, and children, used whatever tools they could find, no matter how primitive. Seemingly everywhere was lean, raw-boned Uncle Joe, as he was referred to generally. Bluntness had also earned him the title Vinegar Joe. Doubtless there were saltier names coined in the ranks. General Stillwell would not have cared what they called him, as long as they did their job. Stillwell was truly a soldier's soldier. He shared the hardships and dangers of his men and gave the phrase real meaning. Stillwell had the unique capacity for commanding respect and obedience while evoking a genuine affection. Perhaps no group regarded the general and the man with warmer feelings than did the Chinese troops in his command. It was no secret that General Su, as he was called, had consistently extolled their courage and promoted their welfare, often in the face of adverse opinion from above. Repaying that faith now were unbroken Chinese victories in the field. Elsewhere in southern Burma, names like the Salween and Irrawaddy rivers were back in the news. But now these were scenes of successes. It was the enemy who yielded, as British-led Allied forces reclaimed more and more of Burma's soil. North and south, it was the same story. An old humiliation was being erased. It was now 2 years since the retreat from Burma, and the 61-year-old general could see his timetable for victory working out on schedule. Under the circumstances, a birthday celebration was a pleasant and well-earned respite. The presence of a son, Colonel Joseph Stillwell, Jr., marked it a family occasion as well. But however welcome, such respites must be few and far between. The forgotten war in both South and North had reached its climax. The Japanese knew well that each mile of ground lost in northern Burma meant another mile added to the link between India and China. The Lido Road was growing. On the heels of combat troops, often under Japanese harassment, came the men who must hack out that road. The land itself fought back. Jungle growth would completely reclaim and obliterate in 2 weeks' time the work that neither the Japanese nor disease nor climate would halt. Against the Japanese, there was the rifle always close by. To fight the soil, every weapon from the axe to explosive charge was employed. The work went on. General Joseph Stillwell was almost literally dragging his road behind him. Yet, as he pushed on, and the Japanese grudgingly yielded, the mule trail became a road. In relative safety, engineering could expand the road into a solid truck route. As it neared completion, the derisive phrase, "impossible road," was heard less often. Across jungle-covered plateaus it stretched, across rivers untamed since the creation, yet now they have been harnessed and bridged. Across mountain ranges it traveled to narrow the gap between India and China. Then inevitably came the great day, the day when a first convoy could move along its 1,044-mile length. The enemy had been pushed out of northeast Burma, and the way lay clear. Considering the difficulties and the hardships that had been borne in shaping its tortuous route, it was truly a military miracle that it was built. The Lido Road was now a reality. The first convoy rolled into Kunming, a token of the supply flow to follow. Honoring the man who had weathered all opposition to build the route, it was renamed the Stillwell Road. 4 months later, Allied command could announce victory in Burma. What of the man who had built the road and forged that victory? The tides and cross-currents of events had taken him far from what would have been his hour of triumph. Receiving his 4th star, General Stillwell came home to serve as commander of ground forces. Then, after the Pacific, for a tour of battlefronts and installations. In the course of those next months, he became commander of the 10th Army. Later, he was to serve as commanding general at Okinawa. But wherever the assignment, the Stillwell story remained unchanged. He was still blunt, unassuming Uncle Joe. The general with no patience for pomposity and pretense. He was still the gaunt, typical American who somehow reminded of the symbolic figure Uncle Sam. More important, he was still the Joseph Stillwell with an understanding of the men in the ranks and a talent for winning their affection. It was, of course, his own feelings being reflected, as warm feelings always are. Summer of 1945 was ending, and so too World War II. Like MacArthur, who had vowed to return to the scene of an earlier defeat and erase its humiliation, General Stillwell would welcome the date September the 2nd. Aboard the battleship Missouri, on that day, General of the Army Douglas MacArthur submitted the formal surrender terms to a defeated enemy. An end had come to the agonies of a tortured world. Peace had come, in victory and with honor. Once again for General Stillwell, there was assignment to the Presidio, but now as a prelude to well-earned retirement. At nearby Carmel was his family and the home he loved. Here he had planned to pass the rich remaining years that lay ahead. But that was not to be. On October 12th, 1946, after a short illness, stout-hearted Joseph Stillwell died. By his own instructions, any pompous ceremony was omitted. His ashes were strewn out on the Pacific, in an area he knew well and loved. At West Point, one can still find Stillwell's old campaign hat and combat boots. There hangs, too, a portrait that pays tribute to Joseph W. Stillwell's career of service to his country, to the men he led, and to the example of leadership that he gave America. He was, indeed, one of the great generals of World War II. In 1942, he stepped forth, like some warrior of old, to lead and inspire vast forces of men in North Africa and Sicily. At a pace never equaled, his Third Army swept across the continent of Europe. No American leader was more colorful and more successful. General George S. Patton, Jr., dedicated to glory and to victory, one of the great generals of American history. From his earliest years, this lad believed he was going to be General George S. Patton, Jr. His imagination was stirred by stories of great heroes of the past, told by his father. His military career began at Virginia Military Institute. At West Point, he proved himself a model cadet and an early leader among his peers. He established the first football team for soldiers, an action that would grow into a powerhouse of national champions and long-standing tradition. World War I. Convinced that this ponderous vehicle would someday come into its own, he studied it, rode into battle on it, became a hero alongside it. Our first tank commander, he would always be linked with the weapon that symbolized his driving, overwhelming personality. After the war, the tank school at Fort Meade. Two officers here shared a deep military interest, Ike Eisenhower and George Patton. The fierce expression, his get-up at masquerades reflected some deep instinct to play the role of warrior or fighter. His wife joined in, sensing that even in fun, these roles suited her soldier husband. The time came, as it had before, when the clothing of battle was to be worn by millions of Americans. Two Axis spearheads were headed east. In the north, von Bock was pursuing his way through the Ukraine to the Caucasus. In the south, Rommel was driving toward the Egyptian border. These two spearheads were intended to meet in Iran and head eastward toward India. In the Orient, Japan had occupied the coast of China, the East Indies, Malaysia, and Burma in the preparation for the drive westward through India. If these two enemy spearheads were allowed to meet, Russia and China, except for their remote Arctic ports, would be completely isolated. Japanese raw materials and German production would be combined. The peoples of Europe, Asia, and Africa, 7/8 of the world's population, would be enslaved. By morning, a decision, both bold and revolutionary. Bold because in this, our darkest hour, we dared to take the offensive. Revolutionary because that offensive was conceived, planned, and executed by the peoples of two nations. The time and the place had been agreed upon. North Africa. Code name for the combined operation was Acrobat. Why North Africa? What was the plan called Acrobat? The convoy from America was heading east, the one from Britain heading south. At a given point west of Gibraltar, the British convoy would divide. For 12 hours, the two halves would proceed in opposite directions. Then the second half would reverse its course and follow the first, passing Gibraltar 24 hours behind. Thus, with clock-like precision, the combined operations would begin simultaneous landings at Casablanca, Oran, Algiers. Casablanca to protect our flank against an Axis attack through Spanish Morocco. Oran and Algiers to secure bases from which to press eastward. Then, the occupation of Tunisia, from which we could cut Rommel's supply lines across the Mediterranean. Next, trap and destroy Rommel's Africa Corps between our Allied forces and the British Eighth Army. Thus, one arm of the Axis pincer would be amputated, and supply lines around the Cape of Good Hope would be shortened by half through winning control of the Mediterranean. North Africa would be under Allied control, with bases from which to stab at the heart of the Axis citadel. Those were the main objectives of the plan called Acrobat. In both convoys, the men kept fit, now knowing the task that lay ahead. For most of them, this voyage would be a new experience. They'd never been so far from home before. In command of American forces for the invasion of North Africa, Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. The enemy knew nothing until the last possible moment, when the first half of the convoy from Britain steamed past the fortress of Gibraltar. It was at night that the ships passed through the straits. The time had been carefully chosen, for here in narrow waters, attack seemed certain. Aboard ship and on the rock, everyone stood to, but the ships moved steadily on. It was as though, for the moment, the enemy's sword had fallen from his hand through indecision. This time, it was in Rome and in Berlin that the lights burned all night. For the first time since the war's beginning, somebody else was calling the tune. Before the enemy could collect its wits and its forces, our ships lay as planned off their appointed destination. Events planned 4 months earlier moved to a climax. Off Casablanca stood the convoy from America. General Patton spoke to the troops aboard ship.
Soldiers and sailors, it is not known whether the French African army will contest our landing, but all resistance, by whomever offered, must be destroyed. However, when any of the French soldiers seek to surrender, you will accept it and treat them with the respect due a brave opponent and future ally. Remember, the French are not Nazis or Japs.
November the 8th, 1942. Orders of the day. The words, "Play ball," transmitted by the task force commander, signifies that all forces are to take vigorous and offensive action against the enemy. A large searchlight shown in a vertical position at night signifies that the enemy has agreed to the terms of the Allies. With the words, "play ball," the fight was on in Casablanca. Meanwhile, in Algiers, our landing craft also met fire from shore batteries, which was soon silenced by ships of the British Navy. Here, too, the French troops ashore were asked by radio to indicate a friendly attitude by throwing their searchlight beams vertical. It wasn't long before here and there along the coast, searchlights were seen pointing to the heavens. As dawn broke, fighter planes from Gibraltar, fitted with extra fuel tanks, took off without even waiting to hear whether the landing fields at Algiers had been captured. By 7 a.m., resistance at Algiers was finished. British and American troops had landed east and west of the city, penetrated the area, and held the heights from all vantage points. In Algiers on that famous November the 8th was Admiral Jean Delon, French Vice Chief of State under Marshal Patton. It was after consultation with him that the French commanding general agreed to surrender the city. In Oran, American paratroops and airborne infantry flown from Britain 1,500 miles away had landed to capture airfields, while other American troops had poured ashore on the beaches protected by the British Navy. Here, as in Algiers, the fighting lasted for only a few hours. But at Casablanca, the battle still raged. Shore batteries and the heavy guns of the French battleship Jean d'Arc and several cruisers, destroyers, and gunboats put out a devastating pile. Gunnery from American ships, coupled with precision bombing, silenced those guns. Striking north and south of the city, shock troops cut the railways, other lines of communication, then converged upon the town. Two days later, the Germans invaded unoccupied France, whereupon Admiral Delon declaring Patton a prisoner of the Axis and himself the chief of state, ordered the cessation of hostilities. In proof of the surprise of our landings, German armistice commissions were caught flat-footed in each city. Their jobs? To bleed North Africa of her raw materials and farm products. The people of North Africa were evidently not sorry to see them go. One of the outstanding features of this campaign was Patton's bold leadership and the impression he left on French and Arabs alike. Long-range plans could now be discussed, plans which would cast America's toughest general in a leading role. Meanwhile, a battle was raging to the east in Tunisia. His tankers, whom he roused to a pitch of fighting spirit, joined the fighting. Allied leaders sensed Patton's remarkable military gifts, his judgment, his sure instinct for what the enemy would do. Patton set a tank trap for Rommel. Rommel marched right into it. His 10th Panzer Division lost half its 60 tanks, retired, and never attempted a counterattack. The Americans blitzed their way into Bizerte. The British smashed right through the center to capture Tunis. Then a British armored column crashed across the neck of the cape to Hammamet. Another British column raced around the tip of the cape to prevent any evacuation. The whole Axis mass was split into 4 segments. The end came quickly. By tens, by hundreds, by thousands they came. On foot, in trucks and behind their bands. The greatest mass surrender of fully equipped troops in modern history. Allied losses totaled nearly 70,000 men, dead, wounded, and missing. 35,000 British, 18,000 Americans, 15,000 French. But for every man the Allies had lost, the Germans had lost 5. And at the end, 15 full divisions, 266,000 of Germany's best men laid down their arms. With this victory came the end of the Axis Empire in Africa. His reputation grew. He looked forward eagerly to his next campaign. He'd been selected to command a new army, the 7th, slated for the conquest of Sicily. An order of the day from Patton to his men. Remember that we as attackers have the initiative. We must retain this tremendous advantage by always attacking, rapidly, ruthlessly, viciously, without rest. Keep punching. God is with us. We shall win. Attack. Attack. And when in doubt, attack again. Patton's major principle for fighting battles or a war. His chief mission, he believed, was to arouse the morale of his men. He urged them on, certain that speed and boldness could shorten the war. Like British General Bernard Montgomery, known as Monty, he believed in showmanship. But he was aware that if the act could not be carried off in fine style, the men would see through it. Both leaders used every means to inspire the troops of their vast command. Sicily proved to be a model campaign. Sound tactics and a fighting spirit won the island in just 38 days. The Supreme Allied Commander paid a visit. Passionately involved in the work at hand, Patton had acquired a reputation for being tempestuous, sometimes rash. There was a question as to his role in the invasion of Europe. Then, his whereabouts carefully concealed from the German High Command, he appeared in Great Britain. New troops heard him in an introductory speech and called him Old Blood and Guts. The old-timers referred to him as the Old Man. Many felt that he knew more about fighting than any man alive. On D-Day, behind Bradley's First Army, another army assembled, Patton's Third. With plenty of armor, this outfit was like its commander, fast, hard-hitting, spirited, spectacular. From the Cherbourg Peninsula began a rolling advance, an all-out smashing attack, a Patton version of a German blitzkrieg. Saint-Méroux, the beginning of a long list of towns occupied by Germans one day, liberated the next. At the head of a vast crusading army, Patton fulfilled a destiny he had dreamed of since early youth. The attacks were now in all directions at once, toward the south, and north, and east, toward Germany. The Third advanced like a tidal wave. The enemy's response was fear. Patton told his men, "In the last 2 weeks, the Third has advanced farther and faster than any other army in history. My intention is to move farther and faster still." Outrunning its maps, the Third Army crossed the Seine. In Patton's words, he was touring France with an army. He was everywhere at once, covering the great distances within his command. His use of light aircraft exemplified his eagerness to adopt any new means of increasing efficiency. Throughout, the 19th Tactical Air Command of the 8th Army Air Force gave Patton's troops close air support. The astounding advances went on and on. Patton saw nothing in the way. He was ready to push on into the heart of Germany. Struggling to keep up with his fast-moving front was a miraculous supply effort known as the Red Ball Express. But now, Patton's supply lines were strained to the utmost. Winter was approaching. Other Allied armies were feeling the pinch. The Third was ordered to hold up, to take the defensive. Nothing but defeat itself could have made the general more depressed. This was a difficult time for an army built to roll. The tension for Patton was finally eased. He was assured by his old friend that the Third would eventually receive adequate supplies to resume what they had begun. Patton urged his leaders to keep high the morale created during the offensive. He himself delivered the pep talks for which he was famous, giving credit, instilling pride, urging men to even greater deeds. Then, the green light. In 400 years, the fortress city of Metz had withstood every assault. But Metz was no cheap victory. The fall of this highly regarded fortification bore out Patton's belief that no defense position had ever been successfully defended. With General Walker at the front, new plans now. A great drive toward the highly reputed Siegfried Line. But an instinct for what the enemy will do had alerted him to a new danger. Field Marshal von Rundstedt struck with 20 divisions on a 40-mile front, the Battle of the Bulge. Patton was asked to speed what help he could. Could it be in 3 days? Ike asked. Patton's armored troops would make it in 2, dashing 100 miles over icy roads to Bastogne. Then, at the heart of a major attack, Patton's concentrated armored power. The Nazis fell on the defensive. They were never to regain the advantage. The Third broke the back of the German offensive and began preparations for their own. Always, Patton pushed them harder than anyone had pushed them before. Always, the results were more than they might have expected. For a commander who was so obviously a winner, they would do the impossible. Patton believed in decorations, in recognizing and exalting the heroic qualities of his men. And they sensed his sincerity when he used words like duty, patriotism, and loyalty. To him, these words had real meaning. The Siegfried Line. In Patton's words, this monument to the stupidity of men cracked easily. The famous Third was now on the loose again, on a spring rampage that would bring the war to a close before summer. Again, Patton's army was going beyond expectations. The enemy believed Patton would pause at the Rhine. He went right across. Now, along a wide front, his divisions fought toward the final goal. Always, he took time out to give credit where it really belonged, to the men. To Private Harold A. Garman, the Medal of Honor. Exalting sacrifice, Patton never dwelt long on the horrors of war. But as his Third Army overran concentration camps in Germany, he saw horror of a new kind. Victories piled up as the Third turned southwest to link up with Soviet forces in the Danube Valley. It was over. The Allied victory was complete, and Patton was a major factor in crushing the Nazis and bringing them to the peace table. On his return, Americans showed their gratitude. In General Pershing's words, "It didn't hurt America to have a general so bold that he was dangerous." Los Angeles went all out in its reception. With him was General Doolittle, whose 8th Air Force in Europe did so much to assure final victory.
Although no unit, no individual won the war, we're fortunate in having one here tonight with us who had a large part in winning the war. I'm pleased and proud to have been privileged to fight by the side of General George Patton. Your Honor, the Mayor, General Doolittle, soldiers, ladies and gentlemen, coming over here, there was a very great lesson. The first 4 hours, we passed over a destroyed land, utterly destroyed. You who have not seen it do not know what hell looks like from the top. That's what Germany looks like. That's what Austria looks like. That's what any place that the 8th Air Force and the 3rd Army worked on looks like. You must remember this, that from Brest to various towns in southern Germany and Austria, whose names I can't pronounce, but whose places I have removed, the trail of the 3rd Army and the 19th Tactical Air Command and the 8th Air Force is marked by more than 40,000 white crosses, 40,000 dead Americans.
Few realized how deeply he felt about his men. In Germany, with no more battles to win, Patton watched Americans compete on the playing field. Again, he saw the fighting spirit, the will to win, a quality he loved and admired and which epitomized himself. Struggle was the test of a man. War, the supreme struggle, provided the highest test. He had expected his own death to be spectacular. In this one prediction, he was more mistaken than in the planning of any battle. He died of injuries received in an automobile accident 4 months after the end of the war. The place of burial? Among the men of the Third Army who had fallen in the Battle of the Bulge. His personality lives on in this statue at West Point. He lived for action and glory and reached the heights in serving his country as one of the greatest generals in American history. 1945. Dwight David Eisenhower returns to his hometown a true war hero. The man who led the greatest armada in the greatest war America had ever fought was returning home, and the warmth with which the people of Abilene, Kansas greeted this distinguished general reflected the deep joy of a nation approaching peace again. Some of it was the kind of welcome any hometown might give a favorite son who had done a good job. But more than anything else, it was a tribute, a gratitude felt in every corner of the Allied world, no less than in Abilene, towards a man who led the free world to its victory. It was a great war with many battles and many triumphs, but it found its symbol in one day above all others. D-Day, June the 6th, 1944. The invasion of Fortress Europe was one of the greatest military adventures of all time. But from the outcome of this bold adventure hung the fate of war and freedom. It was because so much of man's hope had been bound up in the success of this adventure that the architect of that success found the hearts of the people open to him from Europe to Abilene, the town of his boyhood, where the adventure of Dwight D. Eisenhower the man began. The Eisenhower Museum in Abilene is visited daily by citizens from all parts of the country, ranging from dignitary to schoolboy. Inside the museum, the life of Dwight Eisenhower, boy and man, is depicted in a series of murals. From infancy, that life had the flavor of grassroots America. Eisenhower was born in 1890 in Denison, Texas, of parents whose families had migrated to Pennsylvania from Europe and thence to the American Midwest. Young Eisenhower's parents had lived in Abilene before his birth, and it was Abilene, once the wild town at the end of the Chisholm Trail, now a peaceful village of the plains, to which they returned when he was an infant. And it was here that he grew to maturity through a childhood that was active, eager, and happy. An experience shared with devoted parents and spirited brothers, a childhood as rich in the important things of life as ever graced the development of any man. It was an active boyhood in which sports played an important part. He excelled at baseball, both in school and on a vacant lot next to his home. But football was his first love, and his high school coach called him the most outstanding tackle in the valley. Dwight D. Eisenhower's home overflowed with patriotism as well as faith, and of respect for things of the mind. Work was also a staple of the family routine. The creamery where young Eisenhower worked during his spare time while he was in school was one of Abilene's light industries. In this way, and by these standards, young Dwight Eisenhower grew to a manhood the world would one day know well. He was 20 when he left Abilene for the military academy at West Point. Many a great American has begun his march into history as a cadet on the plain at West Point. Eisenhower was graduated from the military academy in 1915 and commissioned a second lieutenant of infantry. A new phase of life was beginning. In the summer of 1916, as a newly promoted first lieutenant stationed at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, he married Mamie Geneva Dowd of Denver. Events in Europe were forging a new phase of life for the entire world. World War I gave many a future general his first experience with combat, but young Eisenhower was not among them. World War I brought him instead command of a tank training center at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where he prepared troops of the new tank corps for overseas duty. His performance won for him the Distinguished Service Medal, but before he was able to get to Europe, the war ended. In the late 1920s, after graduation from the Command and General Staff School, Major Dwight D. Eisenhower was assigned to France to prepare a guidebook on American battlefields in Europe. It was his first direct experience with that continent. With the 30s came other assignments, climaxed by service under General Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines. For 4 years, he worked with MacArthur, who was Commander-in-Chief of the Philippine Army, to help the Commonwealth government work out a plan for its military defense. Ordered back to the States in December 1939, Lieutenant Colonel Eisenhower went to Fort Lewis, Washington as executive officer of the 15th Infantry Regiment. In the dark spring of 1940, German armored divisions were crashing through Holland and Belgium. The Luftwaffe was streaking its destruction through Europe's skies. France was prostrate, and beleaguered Britain was standing alone. The United States had passed the Selective Service Act to prepare for what inevitably lay ahead. And the biggest challenge in Colonel Eisenhower's life was to aid in that preparation. Late in 1940, he was made Chief of Staff of the 3rd Division, where his staff work brought him assignment as Chief of Staff of the 9th Corps. In the summer of 1941, Colonel Eisenhower became Chief of Staff to General Walter Kruger, whose newly organized Third Army was preparing to participate in the most realistic war maneuvers yet held by American troops. In these maneuvers over the Louisiana countryside, as America fought for the time to train its growing army of citizen soldiers, Eisenhower's task was to work out a plan of defense against an invading mechanized force. Soon after the maneuvers were over, Eisenhower was promoted to Brigadier General, and within a matter of days came the bombing of Pearl Harbor. From almost this moment on, the fate of the nation and the fate of General Dwight D. Eisenhower would be bound together. Called to Washington in the first weeks after the war began, Eisenhower went to work in the War Plans Office of the War Department. Among the plans formulated during this time was the strategic decision to make an eventual attack across the English Channel, the principal Allied offensive effort. Because an all-out Channel invasion would be impossible before 1944, and because the need for offensive action was immediate in 1942, the Allies undertook, as a combined operation under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the invasion of North Africa. The minimum objective of this maneuver was to seize the main ports between Casablanca and Algiers. Along the rim of the North African coast, troops were ashore in late November, encountering little real resistance in the Algiers area to a strong, ongoing battle at Casablanca. The commander's hope held was to push quickly east along the Mediterranean and take the important ports of Bizerte and Tunis. Events moved swiftly. To Algiers came General Anderson, commanding the British First Army. General Giraud took command of the French land forces. United under General Eisenhower, they were ready to take the field. Once more, the tricolor, the Stars and Stripes, and the Union Jack flew side by side. But the enemy had lost no time. Across the Mediterranean by sea and by air, he was pouring men and equipment into Tunis. Despite this, the Allies were determined to start the campaign at once, hoping to reach the distant cities before the enemy's grasp had become too strong. The Allies managed to fight their way across the desert to the Tunisian border, but then the German attack almost forced them back into the desert. From the skies, a bombardment which caused great damage to the Allied effort. Soon, supplies became scarce. Casualties were heavy. Even as the goal was in sight, the race had been lost. This first thrust had failed. In the spring, battle lines were drawn. In the north stood the British First Army. In the center, General Giraud's French troops. In the south, the Americans. Farther south, a small group of fighting French had completed its historic 1,500-mile march and taken up positions on the left flank of the British Eighth Army, which faced the formidable Mareth line. Behind stood Rommel's army. Tunisia was crowded with German troops, 15 full divisions, all well-experienced fighters. They were battle-wise veterans of Poland, France, the Baltics. Together with 7 Italian divisions, they were armed with the most modern types of equipment, including the newest fighters and bombers of the German Luftwaffe. German orders were, hold Tunisia at all costs. Keep control of the Mediterranean. Of the various strategies to be employed against the Germans, General Eisenhower chose one which he hoped would shape the entire military situation in terms of a cylinder. The western wall was Allied land forces along the great dorsal mountain range. The northern and eastern, Allied air and sea power concentrated in the Mediterranean. The seaports of Tunis and Bizerte were to act as the intake valve through which those enemy troops who escaped the devastating impacts of planes and submarines based at Malta were to be sucked into the cylinder. At the bottom of the cylinder stood the powerful British Eighth Army to serve as the piston, which in its upward stroke would push the enemy into an ever smaller space. Still in possession of the Nazis were certain high hills to the west of Tunis and Bizerte. Their capture was an essential part of the entire strategy. Because the hills were the spark plug which, when the piston had forced the enemy into a state of high compression, would explode in a combustible mass. That was the final strategy. To succeed, perfect coordination would be necessary between land, sea, and air forces. The blow was now struck by 50,000 men on the ground and by bombers, fighters, and tank busters from the air. The Germans, moving their armor too late, were pinned down by the British at Mareth. The New Zealanders drove through. The Mareth line had been turned. The Piston was on the move, its speed made possible by the feats in road building by the South African engineers. Air and naval forces shelled and bombed all along the seawall. Fighters struck at their troop transport planes, knocking them out of the sky by the hundreds. And on land, the British First Army was a constant threat in the north, while in the center, the French had attacked at Pichon. And farther south, the Americans had broken through to El Batar and Mamassi, thus enforcing constant pressure all along the land wall of the cylinder. April 7th. American patrols of light tanks striking eastward met patrols of the British 8th Army advancing northward. For 12 days, the hills west of Tunis echoed with gunfire. Positions were taken, lost, and retaken. When the German lines broke at last, their dead lay in hundreds unburied on the battlefield. As Allied infantry went forward, engineers built roads across the mountaintops for vital supplies to reach them. In 14 days, 11 miles were built. The Allies now felt it was time to bring the battle to a close. British and Americans in the air with everything that could fly. British and Americans on the ground with everything that could shoot. French artillery. French infantry. The British Navy. All poured forth their concentrated fury. This was Blitz warfare, such as the inventors of the Blitz had never dreamed of. The Nazi challenge to the free world to fight or surrender was being answered. After only 8 hours of fighting, the hard crust of German resistance was shattered. Allied armor crashed through. The Americans blitzed their way into Bizerte. The British smashed right through the center to capture Tunis. Then a British armored column crashed across the neck of the cape to Hammamet. Another British column raced around the tip of the cape to prevent any evacuation. The whole Axis mass was split into 4 segments. The end came quickly. By tens, by hundreds, by thousands they came. On foot, in trucks and behind their bands. The greatest mass surrender of fully equipped troops in modern history. Allied losses totaled nearly 70,000 men, dead, wounded, and missing. 35,000 British, 18,000 Americans, 15,000 French. But for every man the Allies had lost, the Germans had lost 5. And at the end, 15 full divisions. 266,000 of Germany's best men laid down their arms. With this victory came the end of the Axis Empire in Africa. The Allied leaders and the men who had fought under them proudly commemorated their victory. One of the greatest products of this victory, in the words of the commander himself, was the progress achieved in the welding of Allied unity, in the establishment of a combat team that was already showing the effects of a growing confidence and trust among all its members. The successful end of the campaign brought personal recognition of Eisenhower throughout the world as a great leader. But the commander himself interpreted this recognition as proof that free men can find in unity the way to victory, even against seemingly invincible odds. The next big campaign, the invasion of Sicily, brought further demonstration of this basic truth. Allied troops took this vital area in the summer of 1943. The effect of Sicily's fall was monumental. Italy surrendered, the first of the Axis partners to capitulate. And now, the Allies prepared for what was to be the most fiercely fought battle of the Mediterranean War, the invasion of Italy itself at Salerno. Through a miracle of courage and tenacity, troops of General Mark Clark's Fifth Army established a beachhead against overwhelming German odds, and went on to take Salerno and the vital port of Naples. With these victories, although heavy fighting and important battles lay ahead, the first major objectives of the Italian campaign were accomplished. Allied forces were on European soil and would be able to pin down German troops far from the scene of the cross-channel invasion planned for the following year. President Roosevelt visited the combat area with General Eisenhower when he came over for the Cairo and Tehran conferences, where agreement was once again established that the principal Allied effort would be the invasion of Europe. Shortly afterward, the man who would command this awesome undertaking was named General Dwight D. Eisenhower, whom people throughout the free world would now call the man of the hour. The Supreme Commander's orders from the combined Chiefs of Staff were quite simple: to land on the coast of France, and thereafter to destroy the German ground forces. But it would take a great deal of effort to execute these orders. Across the Channel, the heavy fortifications lining the coast of France bespoke the Nazis' belief that they could push the invading armies back into the sea. In France alone, 58 German divisions were waiting. Preparing for the invasion was a job that required great effort. Incessant and realistic training was of paramount importance. The challenges of morale, the myriad details of coordination on every level, all these were overwhelming. But through those tense months in the early part of 1944, the preparations continued. Intelligence was needed, so agents were parachuted into France or put ashore by submarine or small boat. Every square mile of the Normandy coast was photographed. Arms and ammunition were dropped to the French underground. The weather was studied. Equipment was stockpiled for delivery to the beachhead. Ships of all sorts, new and old, were prepared.
I assumed command at Schaeff with the best all-round team for which a man could ask. Some had already been working for months in England. Others I brought with me from the Mediterranean. We adopted first a master plan, and then had to coordinate every last detail of the ground, sea, and air plans. While this was going on, we led off with an air show designed to make the landing points as soft as possible, to batter the German communications, and to make certain we'd have control of the air. It was quite a show. Those airmen did a magnificent job.
Polish, Czech, French, British, and American flyers bombed and strafed German marshalling yards. Supply and troop trains were targeted. Almost all the bridges over the Seine River were destroyed between Paris and the sea. In the late spring of 1944, the invasion plans came alive with the movement of troops and materiel through the southern towns of Great Britain to the ports on the Channel. Across the Channel, aware of the impending invasion attempt, the Germans stood by their guns. Reinforcements arrived from the Reich. The German generals were prepared, their armored might at the ready. They looked across the Channel at Britain and declared death to any invasion attempt. Finally, after being postponed one day because of weather conditions, the eve of the day of decision was at hand. The commander visited the airborne troops who would lead the invasion. "I found the men in fine fettle," he wrote later, joshingly admonishing me that I had no cause for worry. Troops were loaded aboard the Armada. They knew this was the greatest invasion fleet that had ever sailed, They had trained long and hard for this moment. Jokes relieved some of the tension, yet apprehension gripped every man. At the final briefing, the men were told where they were going and when they were to hit the beach. They were told how far inland they would have to fight to link up with the airborne troops. On the eve of battle, Mass was said. In the morning, they would face the Germans.
From the moment of embarkation to that of landing, the full burden fell upon the Navy and our merchant fleets. They had to sweep the mines, bombard the coastal batteries, marshal and protect the transports along the coastline preparatory to landing, and, finally, man the small boats that carried the soldiers to the beach. On that day, there were more than 8,000 ships and landing craft on the shores of Normandy. It was a most intricate task and a vital one for the success of our plans. The courage, fidelity, and skill of the Royal and American Navies have no brighter page in their histories than that of June 6, 1944.
D-Day, with the fate of the war hanging in the balance. Half a million troops, backed by millions more, faced outward across the stormy sea. On beaches that dotted the French coast of the Channel, British, Canadian, and American troops touched shore. The first fateful moment passed, and Allied troops were holding on French soil. In London, all was quiet. Only a few people knew. The secret had been tightly kept. Around daybreak, correspondents were called and told to be at the Ministry of Information at 8 a.m. And then the whole world knew that the Allies had a foothold on the European continent. One week after the landings, the commander was able to say to the vast armies under him, "Your accomplishments in the last 7 days of this campaign have exceeded my highest hopes." Less than 2 months after the invasion, the Allied force broke out of the beachhead perimeter in the hedgerow country around Saint-Lô. Completion of the breakout was the next step, and then began the dramatic pursuit, spearheaded by General George S. Patton's armored force across the heart of France. And then the grand, triumphant march through Paris, which was freed by French troops and soldiers of the U.S. Fifth Corps. Beyond Paris lay the liberation of Belgium and the yard-by-yard struggle across the German border. Blocking the steady pursuit of victory lay the Nazi counteroffensive in the Ardennes sector, known as the Battle of the Bulge. Through a grim and bleak period of several weeks, the enemy, supported by the most devastating of weather conditions, isolated and assaulted Allied forces. General Eisenhower called upon all troops to rise to new heights of courage and effort. The brave men of the beleaguered forces held and steadily began pressing the enemy back. And from that moment onward, the Supreme Commander counted on weakened Nazi resistance. The bridge at Remagen across the Rhine, one of the sturdiest symbols of the war. With its crossing in March 1945, the heart of Germany's defenses was cracked. There remained the substantial task of mopping up what was left of the Nazi army west of the Rhine and accepting their surrender in the droves that began to appear. The great cities of the German fatherland were rubble as Allied troops moved through them in the last stages of defeat. Both commander and GI were able to find the exultation that comes when victory is close. Victory came finally with the German surrender in a schoolhouse at Reims on May the 7th, 1945. The return to peace was signaled by the Supreme Commander.
I have the proud privilege of speaking for a victorious army of almost 5 million fighting men. They and the women who have so ably assisted them constitute the Allied expeditionary forces that have liberated Western Europe. They have captured or destroyed enemy armies totaling more than their own strength. Merely to name my principal subordinates in the Canadian, French, American, and British forces is to present a picture of the utmost in efficiency, skill, loyalty, and devotion to duty. The United Nations will gratefully remember Tedder, Montgomery, Spaatz, Bradley, Delott, Creer, and many others. But all these agree with me in the selection of the truly heroic figure of this war. He is G.I. Joe and his counterpart in the air, the Navy, and the merchant marine of every one of the United Nations. He has braved the dangers of U-boat infested seas. He has surmounted charges into desperately defended beaches. He has fought his tedious, patient way through the ultimate in fortified zones. He has endured cold, hunger, fatigue. His companion has been danger. Death has dogged his footsteps. He and his platoon commanders have given us an example of loyalty, devotion to duty, and indomitable courage that will live in our hearts as long as we admire those qualities in men.
And then the long and happy road home. For Dwight Eisenhower, that road was paved with the cheers of the people of the Allied countries. In his own homeland, a hero's welcome awaited him. America's greeting for a favorite son. Here, the story of Dwight D. Eisenhower might well have ended on this note of triumphant acclaim for a job so splendidly done. But America had other tasks waiting for its favorite soldier. Eisenhower succeeded General Marshall as the Army's first post-war Chief of Staff. He expressed the belief that one of the greatest pillars of world peace is a strong United States. He visited troops stationed in various parts of the world to show America's growing sense of global responsibility. We must remain, he said, the first champions of those who seek to lead their own lives in peace with their neighbors. Finally, on February the 7th, 1948, the general from Abilene, after 36 years of service to his country, left active military assignment, but not active participation in the life of his nation. He accepted an invitation from Columbia University to serve as president of that great institution, enabling him, so he thought at the time, to devote the remainder of his life to the challenges of education. But events of the post-war world dictated otherwise. The urgent necessity for unity in the free world brought into being the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And it was evident from the outset that only one man could make that vital and complicated organization work. Dwight D. Eisenhower. At the end of 1950, he answered his country's call once more, and once more he was on European soil to assume